What's up, men? Tonight we start now not with a truth seeker or a king, however with something some distance more dangerous and complex. Relationship inside the center, a long time. Because believe it or now not, locating love in a time of plagues, dowies, and chaperones was in some way even extra awkward than texting a person. What you doing? At two, lamb. From courtly love songs to marriage via livestock negotiation, medieval romance was less about butterflies and more about land rights. So earlier than you get relaxed, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but most effective in case you truly revel in what I do here. And let me understand inside the comments in which you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's continually fascinating to look who's becoming a member of us from around the sector. Now dim the lighting fixtures, maybe activate a fan for that soft heritage hum, and allows ease into this night's journey collectively. So you are standing in a medieval village, or perhaps a chilly stone citadel, questioning the way to discover love. Maybe strike up a communication, praise someone's hose, ask if they come here regularly. Nope. That is now not how any of this works. In case you're within the middle a long time, dating within the current sense does not sincerely exist. You don't flirt, text, or move for long walks to see wherein it is going. As an alternative, your parents or your lord or your abbot are already deciding who you will marry, while, and what number of cows it'll take to seal the deal. If you're a noble, you've possibly been betrothed seeing that earlier than your voice dropped. You and your destiny partner might meet for the first time for your wedding ceremony day. And sure, it really is just as uncomfortable because it sounds. The whole thing is set land, titles, and own family alliances, no longer compatibility or how accurate they may be at lute solos. If you're a peasant, things are barely much less formal, however most effective barely. Your circle of relatives still has a sturdy say, and love is not certainly a part of the discussion. Maybe your dad and mom realize a pleasant female whose own family owns an efficient goat. Perhaps they admire a boy who can thatch a roof without falling off. Boom! Your relationship now. Fortunate you. It's no longer that human beings in the center, a while, don't experience romantic. They do. It's just no longer the concern. The goal is survival, inheritance, and social balance. Falling in love earlier than marriage, it really is unstable. Falling in love outdoor of marriage, that's scandalous. Either manner it is frowned upon, until you are a character in a tragic poem, wherein case pass wild. And but you dream. Perhaps you write a little verse on a scrap of parchment. Perhaps you sneak a glance throughout the market. Maybe, simply perhaps, you fall for a person who wasn't pre-approved with the aid of your circle of relatives' livestock appraiser. But for now, you wait. You obey. You attempt now not to fall for the miller's apprentice. Because on this international, love is probably the goal of poets, but marriage is the work of mother and father, priests and politics. So you suspect a person's lovely. Perhaps it is the way they balance a basket of onions on their head. Perhaps it's the confident manner they beat dust off a rug. Your medieval coronary heart skips a beat. But constant yourself, because in this global, romance would not bloom without a stability sheet. Earlier than you even think about courtship, you would better ask, what do I carry to the table? And if your solution is a fascinating persona, you would possibly need to sit down. If you're a young guy, you'll want land or livestock or tools, or a roof that doesn't leak an excessive amount of. Love letters are fine. However, nothing says husband cloth like healthy oxen and a roof which could survive a moderate storm. In case your father has already promised the pleasant goat in your brother properly, you might need to do not forget the priesthood. In case you're a younger lady, your family desires a dowry. That might be coin, clothing, or a suspiciously beneficent number of geese. Doesn't depend how witty you are. If your circle of relatives cannot pay up, you are possibly to spend a long term perfecting your embroidery by myself. Now shall we embrace you certainly like a person, someone who makes your callous heart flutter. You lock eyes at the well. There's a spark. It is romantic. It's poetic. It is completely inappropriate due to the fact unless your households are on same economic footing, you would possibly as well fall in love with a cloud. If you're noble, it receives worse. Your hand in marriage is tied to land, borders, and political favors. You are now not just a person. You're on foot treaty. Congratulations. Even peasants are not safe. Marriage is practical. You don't marry for butterflies. You marry due to the fact your pig pen borders a person else's wheat subject. You dream of passion. You agree for irrigation rights. But you attempt. Maybe you provide a small gift, a carved spoon, a handful of berries, or your finest slightly cracked mug. Maybe they smile, maybe they don't. But the fact remains. In medieval relationship, economics is the flirting and love is simply an advantage you wish your spouse develops in the end. So shall we embrace you're not a peasant traumatic about pigs or a noble coping with treaties? Shall we embrace you're a knight? Brilliant armor, massive horse, questionable poetry abilities. What's your love life like? Welcome to the bizarre and emotionally laborious international of courtly love. Now this isn't always dating. That is overall performance art. Courtly love turned into a noble hobby, part flirting, element non-secular struggling, and totally impractical. You, the courageous knight, select a noble woman, commonly one who's already married, and vow to adore her from afar. No longer bodily, of root. That could wreck the whole thing. No, you are alleged to suffer elegantly. You would possibly compose some tortured verses about her silver snigger, or how her hair burns like the sun, which in medieval terms manner she has hair, and failed to insult your circle of relatives. You put on her colors at tournaments. You pine, you sigh. You every so often joust someone simply, due to the fact he glanced at her too long. The woman's function. She speculated to Foe that is all very flattering at the same time as maintaining a stage of icy detachment that could terrify a glacier. She may reply with a letter, a token, perhaps a ribbon, but generally she'll simply be mysterious and unattainable. That's the complete point. The emotions are excessive. The real touch minimal. At high quality, you would possibly get a nod from across the hall or a finger, brushed in opposition to your gauntlet during a ceremonial dinner. Something extra, and abruptly it is not courtly love. It is a scandal or worse, adultery. And no person desires that, as a minimum no longer officially. This whole setup worked excellent while every person worried agreed it become generally fake. It became a way to specific longing, devotion, and creative angst, all without disrupting the social order, a medieval venting mechanism if you'll become it dramatic. Simply, did it involve greater poetry than practicality? Constantly. But for an evening caught among battles and boredom, courtly love gave you something to write about and someone to write for. Simply don't anticipate a glad ending, or a kiss, or maybe eye touch. So you have fallen for someone. Verse straight. Now comes the difficult component. Expressing that affection in a society in which touching a person's hand without a chaperone is basically a statement of struggle. Welcome to the medieval solution. Tokens. Think of it as 12th century texting. Gradual, difficult, and open to wildly faulty interpretation. Let's assume you're a knight, and you're hopelessly in love with woman Marjorie of whatever her last name is. You cannot speak to her by myself, and your poems keep getting intercepted by her confessor. What do? You send her a glove or perhaps your embroidered sleeve. Nothing says, I really like you like mailing someone part of your wardrobe. And if you're on the receiving give up, congratulations. You presently have a sweaty linen sleeve you didn't ask for, and the romantic burden of pretending you understand what it manner. Is he confessing love? Asking for a favor? Suggesting a jewel? Who is aware of? Ladies gave tokens too. A ribbon, a bit of hair, a tiny pendant. It was sentimental, certain, but also deeply strategic. Deliver the wrong guy the wrong token, and unexpectedly you're spoken for via a person with a lazy eye and a drinking problem. Tokens have been supposed to be diffused. A glove pinned to your chest, a ribbon tied for your sword hilt. Anybody knew what it supposed, and no one stated what it supposed. The extra cryptic the higher. It was less approximately verbal exchange and greater about doable deniability. Oh, this glove. No, it is now not from Lady Joan. It's simply regarded on my pillow, scented with lavender, completely random. For commoners, tokens were less difficult. Perhaps a wooden carving, maybe a handkerchief you stitched while you were not milking something. It turned into still romantic, simply with greater calluses concerned. Tokens were additionally risky. Giving one to the incorrect man or woman may want to spark rumors. Receiving one you didn't need meant identifying how to, in a well-mannered way, go back someone's sock without insulting their lineage. However, for all of the awkwardness, those tokens carried actual emotional weight. They had been symbols of love in a world that didn't permit a great deal room for it. So you, in the end, build up the braveness to speak for your overwhelm. Perhaps offer them a flower. Perhaps quote a little bad poetry you in reality did not scouse borrow from a visiting minstrel. You are geared up for a moment of intimacy. Alas, you are not on my own. Welcome to the sector of medieval courting surveillance, wherein love is never blind. It is closely monitored with the aid of your mom, your priest, a nosy cousin, and occasionally all three immediately. Shall we say you are a younger girl of marrying age? You are by no means just going for a walk. You're going for a walk with Margaret and her terrifyingly strict aunt, who's already judging your posture. Even in case you're virtually fetching water, someone is looking. A person is constantly looking. It is much less dating, more espionage. And if you're a man seeking to court docket someone, better hope you have the approval of her circle of relatives, her parish priest, and the nearby gossip network. You show up at her residence with vegetation. Her father's at the back of the door sprucing something. Her mom's pretending to stir a pot that hasn't boiled in 3 hours. And the village priest just happens to be passing through on his way to morning prayers at sunset. The common sense behind all this supervision changed into easy. Defend virtue, maintain family honor, and simply prevent any unsanctioned touching, particularly earlier than marriage, especially by myself, particularly ever. Chaperones were there to display harmless interactions, organization outings, monitored, walks, supervised, sitting inside a 2 m radius of each other on a bench simplest, if someone's grandmother is knitting close by and pretending not to listen. The church, of course, had reviews, masses of them. It regulated courtship, the manner a bouncer regulates a nightclub. Monks gave sermons approximately proper conduct and wrote lengthy treatises on the risks of flirtation. Yes, it really is proper. Medieval clergy published anti-flirting manuals. Believe someone copying the ones out by means of candle mild, while priests silently choose you from across the scriptorum. Even letterwa writing wasn't secure. A few monasteries opened love letters simply to display screen for ethical content material. It's proper divine censorship. So, in case you want to fall in love, you must get used to doing it quietly and in the presence of your complete prolonged family and likely God. So you are in love, or at least medieval in love. That is in general longing, confusion, and a whole lot of packing close to windows. You've got exchanged glances throughout a dinner party. Perhaps they picked up your dropped handkerchief and failed to straightaway throw it into the fireplace. The anxiety is unbearable, but you continue to cannot speak freely. There are chaperones, priests, moms lurking like emotional border patrol marketers. So what do? You write a letter. Ah, yes. The secret love letter. the maximum risky piece of parchment, for the reason that excommunication note. That is your hazard to admit your coronary heart, the use of the maximum cryptic, overly poetic language feasible. Because you cannot just say, I really like you. You have to say, my soul is a stag pierced by the arrow of your grace, roaming the forests of craving. Certainly, in case you're literate, which, permits be honest, isn't a given. You pen your message on vellum or hard parchment. In case you're definitely committed, you dirt it with flower petals or fragrance. Just be cautious with that. One noble, by chance, used a love letter to wrap a herring and delivered it to the incorrect woman. They are married now. It's nice. Now comes the hassle of shipping. You cannot just hand it over. You want a courier, a loyal servant, a bribed monk, or a younger sibling with constrained understanding of results. On occasion, even a minstrel could do the job. Making a song your poem within the city square at the same time as pretending it became anonymous, diffused, and the poetry risky. Very unstable. The road among romantic and heresy became thinner than among sufferers for the duration of Lent. In case your metaphor even hinted at anything physical, you might locate yourself confessing to each lust and literary exaggeration. But notwithstanding all of the guidelines, people did write. Some letters survived. Some poems had been copied and surpassed round like forbidden fruit. In a global of inflexible roles and steady supervision, a folded scrap of words may want to sense revolutionary. So that you write, you risk it. You press your trembling hand to the parchment and say everything you can't say aloud. Just do not sign it too surely. You want romance, no longer a church trial. Eventually, a destroy, a ceremonial dinner day, a harvest competition, a maple dance. In brief, a rare moment when your lifestyles isn't always simply paintings, prayer, and pretending you're no longer interested in the blacksmith's daughter. Today, you're allowed to flirt. Form of as long as no one sees, or everybody sees, however pretends now not to. Welcome to medieval galas, where romance blooms underneath the watchful eyes of every person you have ever met, and 3 chickens. Festivals have been one of the few socially authorized moments, while men and women may want to mingle, giggle, and dare, we are saying, make eye contact. There may be tune, there is ale, there's a person carrying a flower crown with risky self-assurance. You've never seen such a lot of people not pretending to be miserable. If you're a peasant, you would possibly try and impress your crush by prevailing the sack race, catching a greased pig, or juggling 3 stale rolls of bread. Nothing says I'm available like falling off a hay bale with dignity. Dancing became your high-quality shot at real bodily contact. The guidelines had been rigid. However, a nicely timed spin or a now not quite unintended hand graze could say extra than any poem. The maple dance, for example, become basically a large excuse for coordinated flirtation, wrapped in ribbons and potential deniability. And if you're noble, your model of flirting at a pageant involved less hay and greater poetry. You may compose a verse on the spot, Compare your woman's eyes to twin candles or different sparkling things, and provide a trinket, optimistically not one which turned into genuinely made with the aid of your servant 5 mins earlier. Meals help too. Provide your beloved a meat pie or percentage a honey cake. In the event that they accept it with a grin, you're doing nicely. In the event that they hand it to their canine, start over with someone else. However, take into account everything you do, someone is looking. A discern, a priest, a bard with a massive mouth, one misstep, and your flirty smile turns into a youthful indiscretion discussed at church for the subsequent 6 weeks. Nonetheless, for a few hours you can fake you're in an international in which love isn't always a transaction, wherein laughter isn't suspicious, and where dancing in public does not lead to penance. Let's consider you are no longer a knight, a noble, or a bard with a lute and excessive feelings. You are an ordinary villager. You awaken with the cows, go to mattress with the chickens, and spend maximum of your day ankle deep in dust. You are now not searching out a poetic soulmate. You are searching out a person who can milk a goat without emotional drama. Welcome to peasant courtship, where romance is practical, gestures are modest, and chemistry way we will live on wintry weather collectively. For your international, dating is much less about long conversations and greater, approximately shared duties. You observe a person you like due to the fact they painting's difficult, do not whinge a good deal, and feature a decent set of teeth. Oh, it is it. That's the complete checklist. You're no longer choosy. You are practical. You do not need fireworks. You want a person who can intestine a fish and maybe doesn't snore too loudly. So how do you show hobby? You deliver gifts, small, useful matters. A basket of eggs, a package deal of firewood, an excellent turnip. And if you're feeling ambitious, perhaps a woven ribbon or a carved spoon. Nothing says I am extreme about you want a spoon you whittled by candle mild at the same time as your pig judged you silently. Conversations happen for the duration of shared chores. You may stroll collectively to the mill, chat at the same time as tending sheep, or change pleasantries at the same time as shoveling something that smells questionable. Nobody's reciting poetry. You are talking approximately the climate, crop yields, and whether or no longer vintage Thomas fell in the nicely once more. And but in its very own manner, it is romantic. There is a sweetness inside the simplicity. A shared lifestyles built now not on idealism, but on cooperation. You already know each other's strengths, weaknesses, and the way fast they run when a goat escapes. Proposals regularly came quickly. In case you both agreed, and the households did too. Marriage accompanied. Perhaps you moved into a shared hut. Perhaps you constructed a new one from scratch with help from the village. You added your great blanket. They delivered a goat. Together, you commenced the unusual miracle of domestic survival. It is no longer glamorous, but it is sincere. You've got performed it. You found a person who can prepare dinner, easy, tolerate your circle of relatives, and does not visibly recoil at the sight of your feet. Authentic love, right? Now it's time to get married, which in medieval terms method you're moving into a contract. Not a dreamy vow beneath the celebrities, a legally binding transaction, often negotiated with all the ardor of a farm animal's public sale. If you're a peasant, it is nevertheless a massive deal. You acquire some witnesses, communicate to the local priest, and try not to ride over the Latin all through the rite. However, behind the candy-sounding advantages is a critical checklist: dowry, land rights, who gets the cow, and what happens if a person dies for the duration of planting season. Ah, sure, romance. If you're from the upper class, buckle up. Your marriage is a full-blown felony negotiation. Your dad and mom, their parents, the priest, the scribe, maybe a cousin who once studied law. They are all in on it. The bride and groom, basically simply status close by, looking decorative and nodding while spoken to. You could, or may, not have even met the individual you're marrying. Your circle of relatives has performed the maths. Your estate needs her fields. Her dowry balances your debts. And each of your coats of fingers, appearance, excellent subsequent to every different. Love is elective. The merger isn't always. And once you're married, it's permanent. Divorce isn't virtually a issue unless you can show a person wasn't baptized, became secretly associated with you, or died and forgot to mention it. Annulments existed, but they required quite a few office work, a bit of success, and a strong bribe. Nonetheless, no longer everything is bleak. Some couples definitely grew to like every different. Shared chore, raising youngsters, surviving winters. These items have a manner of constructing affection, or at least tolerance, which in medieval terms is largely the equal thing. The church became concerned in each step. Marriage became a holy sacrament, one of the 7 massive ones. You failed to simply marry for legal reasons. You married because God wanted a witness, likely two. So that you stand, change vows, and smile as a person hands over a sack of onions and calls it a blessing. So let's assume you have had enough. Sufficient contracts, enough negotiations, enough being treated like a specially valuable sack of flour. You are a noble, however, for once you want to marry for love, no longer for land, now not for lineage, not in your father's strategic pursuits, simply love. Congratulations, you are about to motive a scandal. Noble allotments had been the medieval equivalent of lighting your circle of relatives' tree on fire and dancing within the ashes. If you ran off to marry someone of your own choosing, it wasn't just private rise up. It became political sabotage. Let's say your woman Elelena promised to subbering von property comfy, but you've got fallen head over heels in love with a penniless squire who smells faintly of horses and journey. You meet in secret, whisper candy nothings in the stables, and in the future you vanish off to a monastery where the abbot owes you a prefer. There you marry under questionable legality with only a fearful monk and 2 chickens as witnesses. Back at domestic chaos. Your own family outraged. Your father threatening to siege the groom's own family lawn. Your mother crying into her embroidery hoop. The church deeply concerned. The gossip scrumptious. And if you're the groom on this romantic rebellion, do not get too cozy. Satisfactory case state of affairs. You get to maintain your bride and your kneecaps. Worst case, you are excommunicated and disemboweled in that order. Nonetheless, a few couples were given away with it. If the union couldn't be undone without causing even greater embarrassment, households once in a while simply sighed and moved on. In spite of everything, what is finished is accomplished, and at least no one died. Optimistically, in rare instances, these scandals have become legends. Songs have been written, poems composed, tales whispered at banquets. Two nobles who selected love over duty, nearly mythological. And sure, maximum noble marriages had been transactional. However, those moments, short rebellions, passionate escapes, whispered vows underneath moonlit towers. They reminded the world that love, though inconvenient, refused to move extinct. So, if you ever sense dramatic for swiping left or turning down a second date, simply take into account at the least your love life would not involve mystery weddings, angry barons, and a horse tied to a ladder outside your window. Ah, marriage! That lovely union of two souls and their respective financial portfolios. Due to the fact inside the Center Ages, love became exceptional, however a dowry, now that was sincerely romantic. Let's say you're a bride. You're not just getting married. You are being released like a small dowry, geared-up financial vessel. Your circle of relatives prepares your dowry. Cash, farm animals, land, linens, a cow or two, relying on how cute they assume you are, and perhaps even a hard and fast of pooter dishes if they're feeling generous. Those services visit your future husband who accepts you and your portable wealth with open arms and an intellectual calculator. Now flip the scenario. In a few cultures or areas, it is no longer the bride's circle of relatives giving the goods. It's the bride price. The groom can pay her circle of relatives for the respect of marrying her, efficaciously saying, "Here's a horse, a cloak, and 3 pigs. Now supply me your daughter." Medieval romance at its finest. The factor is, someone is paying someone. You are getting married, and there's sincerely a receipt concerned. These exchanges weren't pretty much wealth. They had been approximately reputation, expectancies, and public statements. A huge diary would possibly imply a bride got here from a prestigious family. A stingy one would possibly recommend they have been seeking to offload her fast, probable due to suspicious character trends, or a habit of speaking again. You, as the bride, failed to commonly get to maintain your dowry. It have become part of the family economic system, controlled by your husband, guarded by the regulation, and with any luck now not gambled away on cube and ale within the first month of marriage. If the marriage ended via demise, annulment, or your husband wandering off to sign up for a monastery after midlife remorse, your dowry could theoretically be again. However, retrieving it turned into often tougher than pulling a sword from a stone. You'd want help, criminal backing, and preferably a person who could study. In the meantime, the bride fee, if paid, become like shopping for a rare goat. Highly priced up front and no refunds. It compensated the bride's circle of relatives for the lack of her labor. After all, who's going to take advantage of the sheep now? So, even as love turned into once in a while in the blend, cash turned into usually on the altar. So you failed to pass the wedding path. Perhaps you had been the second one son, or your dowry was suspiciously small. Otherwise, you simply certainly like chanting. Either manner, you have joined a monastery or convent. Congratulations! You've now taken a vow of poverty, chastity, and an aggressive disinterest in romance. And yet, here you are in a stone cloister surrounded via silence, candle smoke, and Brother Anselm's all of sudden soulful eyes. Sure, even in the back of monastery partitions, forbidden love determined a manner. To be clean, falling in love in a religious order became deeply discouraged. Like you may get whipped, exiled, or lectured by means of someone with a Latin name, discouraged. You've sworn to present your coronary heart entirely to God, which means giving it to literally no person else. But hearts are unruly, and now and again prayers start sounding plenty like love poems. Perhaps it starts off evolved with harmless duties, passing each other bread in the refectory, whispering at some stage in vespers, guffawing a bit too hard while a person drops a hymnal. Earlier than you understand it, you are tucking greater cheese into Sister Beatrix's satchel and wondering the whole lot. A few priests and nuns wrote passionate letters, disguised of path, as theological musings. Your soul is a shining light in the darkness of my contemplation. Sounds holy until you read among the traces. And many did. There have been inevitably scandals, secret meetings inside the herb garden, midnight confessions that were not strictly sacramental, and the occasional gasp-worthy discovery of a nun with a suspiciously round stomach. The punishment, commonly harsh, exile, public penance, or being reassigned to a few some distance off, Abbey recognized broadly speaking for sheep and silence. Nonetheless, no longer all memories resulted in shame. Some fans escaped. A few even got married after being defrocked. Maximum, though, returned to their cloisters, crimson confronted and redevoted, swearing that everything becomes simply an overzealous theological debate. Due to the fact, ultimately, monastic existence become approximately field. However, human beings are human beings, even in robes, even in silence. And on occasion, a quiet glance across the chapel became extra exciting than any match or courtly poem. You probably did it. You obtained married. There has been a priest, a pig roast, and a person spilled me for your mother's best nice cloak. But now it has been a few months or years, and something feels off. Perhaps your spouse snores like a demise lute. Maybe they forgot to say their chronic gambling problem. Or perhaps you simply found out that marrying for land and sheep does not mechanically bring about romantic bliss. Either way, welcome to the sector of medieval marital sadness. Now, don't go reaching for the divorce papers because they do not exist. At least no longer in any form you'll understand. Marriage was a sacred and unbreakable bond authorized through the church, sealed by using God, and enforced by way of public disgrace. You could attempt for an annulment, but you would need a superb cause. We do not get along does not reduce it. Should prove that one among you become underage, already married, two intently related, which befell disturbingly frequently, or satisfactory case situation, never consummated the wedding, which supposed a person had to affirm that reality in writing, possibly beneath oath. Right luck. In case you're a noble, it receives messier. Your marriage wasn't simply non-public. It turned into political. Seeking to break out, it can begin a feud, ignite a scandal, or release a minor warfare. Exceptional to simply quietly resent each other and attend separate feasts. So what do sad couples do? Commonly, they simply endure. You sleep in one-of-a-kind beds. You sigh dramatically at dinner. You pour your feelings into embroidery, or that one clearly indignant psalm. Passive aggression turns into your love language. Of root, affairs passed off, generally quietly, from time to time spectacularly. Nobles had secret fans. Peasants had suspiciously helpful associates. The church condemned it, of course. However, that did not forestall humans. It just made them higher at sneaking around barns and blaming matters on God's mysterious will. For ladies, getting out of a terrible marriage changed into specially difficult. Even in case your husband become violent or vanished, society anticipated you to live dependable, silent, and mildly pious, whilst surviving off bread crusts and disapproval. Still, a few people made it work. Marriages weren't constantly happy. However, they may emerge as partnerships cast by using hardship, dependency, and the shared experience of hauling firewood in the rain. Let's consider your partner dies. Maybe it changed into the plague. Perhaps a farm twist of fate. Maybe they tripped over a goose inside the darkish. However it passed off, you're now widowed. And suddenly, the medieval relationship pool opens returned up. Being a widow in the Middle Ages turned into oddly releasing. Not do anything you need liberating, but actually extra freedom than you had earlier then. For girls especially, widowhood often delivered a flavor of independence, managing land, making decisions, even talking in public without being immediately shushed. And in case you had been youngish and nevertheless had teeth, you may remarry fast in no time. Mourning durations existed, but so did survival instincts. A widow with land and no husband turned into basically a strolling treasure chest. Suitors appeared with alarming velocity, some honest, others simply very obsessed on your dairy cows. In case you're a person and currently widowed, society nearly pushes you back into marriage. Who else goes to cook dinner easy and raise the 11 children you one way or the other gathered? So you begin searching. Maybe the baker's daughter. Perhaps that quiet widow who constantly brings suspiciously exact me to marketplace. Romance in second marriages can be rather candy. This time around, you're older, wiser. You are now not being driven into an alliance. You're selecting someone to live on with. Maybe even a person you want. Wild idea. Of root, there were guidelines. The church frowned on remarriage that passed off too fast, like your partner isn't cold but speedy. And widows frequently had to negotiate with circle of relatives over dowies and inheritance. Nothing says romantic second chance like arguing along with your brother in regulation over who continues the butter churn. However, still, second marriages had been commonplace, even predicted. Existence changed into brief. Winters had been lengthy. No one wanted to spend them on my own in the event that they didn't need to. And yes, love turned into a part of it. Perhaps not the swooning sonnet-writing type, but the quiet type. Primarily based on shared tales, mutual admire, and the expertise that each of you had already seen a few matters. So you light the fire, pour the soup, and attempt once more. Not because it's best, but as it's human. You have made it this some distance, survived the contracts, the courtships, the chaperones, and probable a dramatic barn elopement. However, before you fall for someone new, ask yourself the maximum medieval question of all. Are you cosmically allowed to like this individual? Due to the fact inside the middle a while, love wasn't only a count number of the coronary heart. It changed into a remember of stars, bones, and whether or no longer your grandmother noticed a fox this morning. Allows begin with astrology. Yes. Before you kissed everyone, you might want to seek advice from the neighborhood monk astrologer. Are your signs like-minded? Is Venus in retrograde? Turned into the one you love born below an unlucky moon? In that case, hire to marry a person much less cursed. Love is difficult enough without planetary sabotage. Then there were birthmarks, mysterious little symbols that would identify you as your soulmate's lengthy lost twin or their destined executioner. Superstitions have been flexible like that. But the church had its personal checklist. You couldn't marry your cousin or your second cousin or your fourth cousin twice eliminated except you had special permission, which the wealthy frequently sold due to the fact loopholes. So before things were given critical, you'll likely want to draw a circle of relatives' tree and then quietly erase parts of it. Social fame additionally mattered deeply. A noble couldn't fall in love with a peasant without it being declared either a miracle or an ethical failing. Cross-class romance become uncommon, scandalous, and only acceptable if it later became a sad folks' tune. And then there were the omens. If a raven flew overhead, even as you had been considering someone, bad sign. If you dropped bread at dinner while glancing at your crush, neglect it. This is a cursed union. A person may bury an appeal under the doorstep to guard you from fallacious suitors or to sabotage your probabilities. Both worked. Love in this world wasn't simply personal. It turned into mystical. Each person had an opinion. The celebrities, the saints, the weather, and that one lady within the woods who truly wasn't a witch, except she likely turned into. However, in spite of all the regulations, symptoms, and whispered warnings, humans nevertheless loved clumsily, bravely, regularly towards recommendation. Because medieval or no longer, the coronary heart stays splendidly disobedient. You've in all likelihood heard of Alexander the Terrific, perhaps even Julius Caesar, but have you ever heard of the girl who allegedly chopped off the pinnacle of Cyrus the Terrific and dunked it in blood? Her call turned into Tamaris, and she or he did not rule from a throne gilded in gold or inside high-walled cities. No, her court docket turned into the open sky. Her military changed into the wind, and her power got here not from titles, however, from natural, unshakable authority. She was queen of the mace, a confederation of nomadic tribes who roamed the stairs of relevant Asia. Think horse archers, tattooed warriors, ritual feasts, and battlefield justice. Ptolemais failed to inherit her strength from a pampered courtier system. She rose through grit, management, and possibly a healthful dose of don't mess with me electricity. Her humans had been difficult, acquainted with harsh winters, lengthy migrations, and enemies on every side. But even amongst such human beings, she stood out. She was a warrior, a lawgiver, and a ruler in her very own proper. No husband overshadowed her. No brother guided her hand. Now, to be clean, tons of what we recognize approximately Tamirius comes from the Greek historian Herodotus, a person now not precisely recognized for his strict reality checking. But if even a fragment of his account is genuine, then Ptolemais wasn't just a queen. She changed into a hurricane in human form. At the heart of her story is that a foreign superpower became growing more potent by the day. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, led by means of Cyrus the Exceptional. He had already conquered Lydia and Babylon, and now his gaze became east. The Massage have been next on his listing. But Cyrus failed to fully apprehend what type of woman he became coping with. Before the first arrow flew, before the primary spear shattered, and before her son's dying changed the whole thing, Tamias was already making ready for struggle. Not because she desired conquest, however, because she refused submission. She wasn't just protecting territory. She turned into defending a manner of lifestyles. And as Cyrus might soon study, there are a few queens you simply don't invade. Cyrus the Superb had a recognition. He wasn't just any king. He became a conqueror's conqueror. The form of man who may want to walk into ancient cities, topple empires, and nevertheless get remembered fondly with the aid of historians. So whilst he appeared east closer to the land of the Massage, he failed to precisely anticipate resistance. In any case, who ought to likely say no to the person who had taken Babylon without even breaking a sweat? Cyrus sent a well-mannered offer first. Because of direction, each appropriate imperialist begins with a smile. He proposed a political marriage between himself and Ptolemais. Now you would possibly assume it truly is romantic. However, Tomius noticed right through it. She understood that this wasn't approximately love or maybe alliance. It changed into about manage. If she married Cyrus, her state would grow to be just every other province of the Persian Empire, and he or she, a trophy queen. She declined firmly. Cyrus, unaccustomed to rejection, failed to take it well. If he couldn't appeal her into submission, he would take her state through force. He crossed the Araxes River, which separated his empire from the lands of the Magi, and established a foothold. But Tomius wasn't idle. She amassed her warriors, consulted her chiefs, and prepared for what she knew became coming: warfare. Then got here the bait. Cyrus, beneath the guidance of his trendy Harpagus, laid a trap. He left a portion of his army in the back of with a lavish camp overflowing with wine and meals, luxuries that nomads hardly ever indulged in. Tamius's son, Sparapises, led a detachment to research. They raided the camp, took the components, and fatally drank the wine. The Persians again at simply the proper second, drunk, disoriented, and unprepared. Sparapises and his guys have been crushed. He was captured alive. When Tamaris heard the information, her global cracked. This wasn't just an army loss. It became personal. Her son, her inheritor, was now a prisoner in Persian fingers. She dispatched a message to Cyrus. "Supply me again my son and leave. In case you do no longer, I swear by using the sun, the grasp of the rub down, I can provide you with your fill of blood." Cyrus failed to listen. Sparapises, ashamed of his capture, killed himself in Persian custody. Tomius had simply misplaced her only son, and now she was out for blood. Grief is a powerful component, but grief mixed with fury, that's the recipe for absolute devastation. While Tomius found out her son Sparapises had taken his own life in Persian captivity, something internal her snapped. This become now not about borders, satisfaction, or even independence. This became war-soaked in vengeance. And Tomius wasn't one to grieve quietly. She failed to retire to her tent in mourning robes or weep with the aid of the fire. No, she mounted her horse, sharpened her guns, and swore an oath that would echo via records. She would face Cyrus in struggle. She would defeat him. After which she would make sure he never forgot her name, even in death. In keeping with Herodotus, Tamius summoned her tribal council. Under her command, the Massage mobilized. Photograph it. Hundreds of warriors on horseback, decorated in leather-based armor, wielding bows and spears, faces painted with fury. They did not march like a Persian navy. They moved like a storm, fast, chaotic, and with deadly precision. This time she set the trap. Cyrus, perhaps overconfident from his in-advance deception, underestimated her solve. However, Tomius knew his procedures now. She studied his actions, waited for the proper second, and then unleashed the entirety. The two armies clashed in what Herodotus describes as one of the bloodiest battles of the ancient international. There have been no fancy formations or long speeches, just screaming horses, clashing blades, and a queen who fought alongside her warriors. No Silk Road Empress right here. Ptolemaeus was inside the thick of it, using difficult, cutting down enemies with merciless awareness. And while the dust sooner or later settled, Cyrus the Incredible turned into dead. Tamias, ever theatrical in her justice, had his body searched. His head was severed, located right into a wine skin packed with blood, and presented as a final offering. In step with Herodotus, she spoke to it. You thirsted for blood. Now drink your fill. Whether or not every element is authentic is sort of beside the factor, because what topics is that Ptolemaeus one? She overwhelmed the most powerful empire of her day, avenged her son, and made positive that her call could be remembered now not as a sufferer, however, as a conqueror. And this turned into just the start of her legend. The battlefield was silent. The Persians had been lifeless or fleeing. Their legendary king lifeless within the dirt. And Ptolemaeus, she didn't have a good time like a conqueror. She did not parade through pepilollies or carve her face into cash. Rather, she stood over Cyrus's body. Her vengeance fulfilled, but her coronary heart nonetheless broken. Victory, it turned out, didn't convey peace. The rub-down had gained more than only a conflict. They had grew to become the tide of empire. The death of Cyrus, the amazing, sent shock waves across the ancient global. In Babylon, Egypt, and the far corners of the Persian realm, rumors swirled. The unstoppable king had fallen. Now not at the arms of every other wonderful empire, however, by means of a nomadic queen who had no throne, no palace, simply fury, grit, and a cavalry of warriors who might experience into hell for her. And yet, Ptolemaeus didn't take advantage of her victory for conquest. She backed to her humans with the identical pragmatism she ruled with. No warfare taxes, no imperial targets. She did not try to seize the Persian throne. That wasn't her international. Her justice was served. Her son had been avenged. The empire may want to preserve without Cyrus. But now it would think twice before ever riding east again. It's well worth noting just how uncommon this became. Most rulers, after winning a warfare of that value, would have grabbed electricity with each arms. But Tamias appeared more concerned with retaining her human beings' freedom than expanding her attain. And yet, that is where her tale starts to vanish. There aren't any records of her after the conflict. No statues, no royal tomb, no massage monuments carved in stone. She rides into the fog of records, as elusive and untamed as the stairs themselves. Historians debate whether Herodotus exaggerated her story. Some say Cyrus died someplace else, that the wineskin of blood become poetic fiction. However, even skeptics agree a person dealt Persia a heavy blow. And it wasn't a king. It wasn't a fashionable. It turned into a queen. A mom. A female whose love for her son fueled one of the maximum dramatic reckonings in ancient records. And her story, It failed to want to be written in stone. It was carried through the wind. Due to the fact, whilst the wind howls across the steppe, a few nevertheless say it whispers her name too. To apprehend Thomius, you have to understand the people she led. The Rub Down were not your typical historical civilization. No marble temples, no hanging gardens, no scrolls of poetry. They were a nomadic warrior tradition, residing in the good-sized, untamed lands east of the Caspian Sea. Lands too wild for Persian satraps or Babylonian scribes. Their global become one of motion, survival, and honor. Imagine sprawling plains without boundary lines, herds of horses and farm animals as forex, and warriors raised inside the saddle. Kids were taught to trip earlier than they may stroll directly. Archery wasn't a game. It was 2D nature. Their bows have been compact and lethal. Their armor, layers of leather based in scale, bendy for riding, sturdy for conflict. They hunted, they raided, and they fought to guard their freedom. And in contrast to many patriarchal societies of the time, Majit girls should and did combat. That wasn't an exception. It turned into anticipated. Warrior women weren't legends. They had been your neighbors. So when Tamias picked up a sword and led her human beings into war, nobody raised an eyebrow. She wasn't pretending to be a man or defying norms. She became the norm, simply sharper, smarter, and a ways greater dangerous than most. Their society valued strength, however also justice. Crimes had been punished harshly, however pretty. Assets was communal in lots of methods. What mattered changed into loyalty to the tribe and the capacity to guard it. Kings and queens dominated, sure, but via consensus, no longer tyranny. Leaders needed to prove themselves through deeds, now not bloodlines. And as for religion, they were solar worshippers. Thomius, in her well-known warning to Cyrus, swore by way of the sun, the grasp of the Rub Down. The sun changed into existence, mild and justice, the divine choose of all oaths. To break one's word changed into to spit within the face of the heavens. In short, Tamias wasn't some anomaly. She was the proper embodiment of her humans. Fierce, principled, proud. She failed to rise to strength in spite of being a female. She rose due to the fact she became exactly the form of chief the Masash respected. While the Persians had forms, the Maseg had freedom. And in one brutal, records-defining clash, that freedom held its ground. Due to the fact while you come from a land where the wind by no means stops and the sky is your best ceiling, submission is absolutely no longer in choice. You know what's unusual? Everything we understand about Tamias, her war with Cyrus, her son's loss of life, the wineskin complete of blood, it all comes from one guy, Herodotus. Now, Herodotus is often referred to as the daddy of records, which sounds splendid until you comprehend he's also the daddy of rumor, fable, and dramatic flair. The man cherished a terrific story. And if that story involved divine omens, gory revenge, or queens shoving heads into blood, well, even higher. So how a great deal of his story is true. That depends on how plenty you consider a Greek writing a long time after the activities, who had probably by no means met a single massage in his life. Herodotus trusted second-hand bills, tourists' testimonies, and something rumors had been circling the Persian Empire. To him, records wasn't only a document. It was a performance. Nonetheless, right here's the component. He chose to inform her tale. In a world brimming with male warlords, tyrants, and kings, Herodotus went out of his manner to focus on a steppe queen who delivered down one of the finest rulers in records. It's no longer not anything, but allows zoom out. Why did this tale spread so extensively? Easy. It had the entirety. A noble woman, a sad son, a foxy enemy, a war to the demise, a gory finale worth of any Greek tragedy. If you were residing in Athens or Thebes and heard this tale from a visiting bard, you'll don't forget Ptomius forever. Not because she wore a crown, however because she dared to defy a superpower and received. And over time her tale morphed. Medieval chronicles painted her as a savage Amazon. Renaissance artists depicted her drenched in blood, preserving Cyrus's head like a trophy. She was special, fearsome, iconic. But through all the retellings, something actual clings to her legend. Maybe not the precise speak, perhaps no longer the wineskin, however the bones of the tale, the queen, the sun, the war, the victory, sense too precise, too human to be pure invention. Ultimately, Herodotus failed to just keep Tamias. He mythologized her. And while that could blur the strains among reality and fiction, it also ensured that her name could live far longer than Cyrus's imperial edicts. Due to the fact history forgets generals, but it recalls vengeance. For a queen with no surviving monuments, Ptomius has haunted the imagination of empires for over 2,000 years. Renaissance painters loved her. She became a dramatic muse, ideal for the bloody climax of a canvas. In 1622, Rubens painted her frivolously maintaining a severed head even as courtiers seemed on in awe. In another, she stands regal and composed even as Cyrus's decapitated head is ceremonially dunked right into a golden vessel brimming with blood. Tasteful. Maybe not. Memorable. Sincerely. To European artists, Ptomius wasn't just an ancient discern. She turned into symbolism incarnate, a girl who punished pride, a savage noble, a cautionary tale, a feminist icon, relying on who was keeping the brush. She ought to represent the righteous fury of a mother, the barbarism of the East, or the knowledge of a ruler who refused to be bought. Writers cherished her too. Inside the 18th and 19th centuries, she appeared in performs, novels, and philosophical tracts. Enlightenment thinkers debated whether she turned into evidence that ladies could govern wisely, or a reminder of what happens while emotions rule leadership. Both manner she stayed in print. But oddly enough, her own humans left no records. The masseg diminished from history, absorbed or erased by way of later nomadic cultures. No carved inscriptions, no burial mounds with gold plaques pronouncing Tamaris turned into here. Her reminiscence survived entirely via outsiders' eyes. And yet she saved reappearing. In Soviet generation Vital Asia, Tamias changed into reclaimed as an image of resistance towards imperialism. Statues of her were erected in Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. Present-day scholars re-evaluated her now not as a bloodthirsty barbarian, but as a legitimate head of kingdom, a woman who ruled, led armies, and negotiated from a role of strength. She has seemed in everything from documentaries to video games. In a single moment, she's a playable chief in a method recreation. Within the next, she's being analyzed in instructional journals on gender and strength. Its range. And here's the odd element. We nevertheless do not even recognize what she appeared like. No cash, no busts, no carvings. However, we recognize what she stood for. Power, vengeance, autonomy, legacy. In an international that forgets queens who behave, Thomius is remembered because she did no longer. She didn't ask to be a part of history's artwork gallery. She kicked the door down and posed for the bloodiest portrait ever painted. Tamias wasn't the primary girl to guide warriors into struggle, and she actually wasn't the remaining. However, history tends to deal with women like her as exceptions, remoted flashes of energy in a person's global. The truth, Thomius turned into a part of an extended, frequently neglected lineage of girls who ruled through the sword. Let's rewind a piece. Before Tamias, there was Shamur-Ramat, the Assyrian queen who may have inspired the mythical Semiramis, builder of towns, slayer of rebels. Around the same era, the Scythians, cultural cousins of the Massagete, had woman warriors buried with weapons, their skeletons showing clean signs and symptoms of struggle injuries. These weren't ceremonial roles. These girls fought, bled, and died on horseback. And after Tamirius got here extra. Boudicca, the Celtic queen who led a fiery insurrection in opposition to the Roman Empire within the 1st century CE, is regularly compared to her. Like Tamaris, Boudicca's warfare changed into sparked with the aid of private loss. Her daughters have been assaulted, her land seized. Her response, she burned Roman settlements to ash. The parallels are uncanny. Grief, vengeance, and an empire too boastful to see what was coming. There may be additionally Zenobia, queen of Palmyra, who in the 3rd century CE defied Rome itself and carved out her very own mini-empire in the East. She minted coins along with her face. She declared independence. She made the emperor come to her. What binds all these girls collectively, Tamias covered, is not just strength, it is audacity. They led in eras that pretended management belonged to men. They wielded authority no longer as caretakers or stand-ins, but as strategists, generals, and rulers. And at the same time as many male leaders have been praised for their conquests, these women were often classified dangerous, unnatural, savage. Why? because they received. Tamias wasn't an outlier. She became a part of an international centurisal lengthy sample of girls who rose in instances of crisis and made kings bleed. Her tale, preserved via Greek pens and modern creativeness, reminds us that lady management wasn't rare. It was just not often recorded. So while you image ancient warfare, do not just see helmets and beards. See a queen on horseback, bow in hand, blood in her eyes, and apprehend Tomius wasn't alone. She was just one of the few they couldn't erase. Tomius in no way constructed a palace. She didn't go away in the back of golden inscriptions or dynastic walls. There's no exceptional tomb, no preserved armor, no marble bust in a museum. But she endures. In many approaches, her legacy is a paradox. Her complete tale hinges on a handful of paragraphs from Herodotus, biased, embellished, in all likelihood fictional. But those phrases planted a seed that refused to die. For over millennia, her call has resurfaced time and again, in times while the arena needed to remember that electricity doesn't constantly put on a crown or a beard. She's been reimagined through such a lot of lenses. To Renaissance Europe, she changed into the noble savage, a caution to tyrants. To fashionable crucial Asia, she have become a folk's hero, a symbol of resistance and countrywide satisfaction, particularly in nations nonetheless reckoning with colonial and imperial pasts. Statues of her rise from plazas in Kazakhstan. Youngsters learn her call in school books. Politicians quote her when invoking energy and independence. However past symbolism and delusion, there's something undeniably human about her story. It is about a mother who misplaced her son. It's approximately a leader forced to choose between surrender and survival. It's about someone who, when cornered via one of the greatest powers the sector had ever visible, chose to fight and received. In a world that frequently erases the names of warrior women, Tomius persists like a blade buried simply below the surface, usually equipped to be unearthed by using a new era hungry for stories of untamed defiance. She reminds us that history isn't always just kings and empires. It's also moms and queens, grief and revenge, dirt and blood. It is the silent moments after war when a lady stands alone in a subject littered with corpses, knowing she has changed the path of the world however will, by no means be completely believed. And that might be her greatest legacy. The refusal to be forgotten. No statues, no hassle. Her call nevertheless rides on the wind of the steppes. Her story still makes emperors' appearance mortal. And her legend nevertheless whispers the caution, "Come for me, and you'll drink your fill of blood." So the subsequent time you pay attention of an exceptional king's downfall, recollect. Every now and then the final blow comes now not from a rival empire, but from a queen on horseback, misplaced to history, however by no means definitely long gone. Consider a life where your walls are manufactured from felt, your roof is stitched from hide, and the front door opens to the horizon. There are not any towns, no farmland, No stone monuments to skip onto the destiny. Simply the rhythm of hooves, the whisper of grass, and the ever-changing sky. For ancient nomadic cultures, permanence changed into a myth, and mobility become power. From the Eurasian steppes to the Arabian deserts, historical nomads shaped whole civilizations without leaving an unmarried marble temple. These weren't ruthless wanderers. They were strategic movers guided by means of the seasons, the grazing styles of their herds, and an intimate understanding of terrain. Their houses had been yurts, tents, or wheeled wagons, foldable fortresses designed for life at the flow. Cattle, sheep, goats, and maximum of all, horses were the pillars of nomadic lifestyles. Someone's wealth turned into counted in livestock, no longer land. Horses had been greater than equipment. They were companions, weapons, and standing symbols. To ride well was to live to tell the tale. To trip excellent turned into to rule. But being mobile failed to mean being disorganized. Nomadic societies had complicated social structures. Energy normally flowed via clans and tribes with leadership, regularly primarily based on merit and influence in place of strict heredity. A primary or KHN would possibly rise through tactical brilliance, oratory talent, or sheer charisma. Loyalty became private, earned in campfire councils and on winkered battlefields. And far from being remoted from the arena, nomads were its connective tissue. They moved silk from China, spices from India, silver from Persia, and slaves from Europe. Nomadic caravans and investors have been the authentic transcontinental couriers, lengthy, before empires caught on. And whilst trade broke down, they raided, swift, strategic, and terrifyingly green. Their records wasn't written in stone. It changed into sung, recited, and remembered. Elders passed down legends and laws via oral subculture. A tribe's complete felony machine, history, and identification might be carried within the thoughts of a single bard or elder. Stories weren't entertainment. They have been guidance, governance, and identity. Within the eyes of empires, nomads have been unpredictable, alien, and threatening. But to themselves, they were guardians of freedom, masters of addition, and heirs to the wind. They left few ruins behind, however they reshaped the world each time they rode. Lengthy before the Mongols thundered throughout Eurasia, the Scythians ruled the windswept steppe. Between the 9th and 2nd centuries B.C., these nomadic warriors ruled the land stretching from the Black Sea to the rims of important Asia. To the Greeks, they had been fearsome horsemen and wonderful barbarians. To themselves, they had been a human beings of freedom, vengeance, and satisfaction. Scythian society was constructed round mobility and violence. Their horse culture was unrivaled. Boys discovered to experience earlier than they may walk nicely. Their guns had been practical and deadly. Brief composite bows, perfect for capturing at the same time as galloping at complete velocity. Curved sword, struggle axes, and iron-tipped spears. The Scythian warrior wasn't just a guy, either. Archaeological finds verify what Herodotus hinted at. Girls fought too. Some graves reveal woman skeletons buried with guns, displaying conflict wounds that most effective came from actual fight. They didn't build towns, but their cairns, burial mounds, have preserved their legacy. Beneath these mounds, archaeologists have located gold, difficult tattoos on preserved pores and skin, embroidered clothes, and complex weaponry. Their artwork fashion, complete of swirling animals and predatory symbolism, displays an existence certain to nature and the hunt. However, the Scythians were not simply wild raiders. They have been diplomats, mercenaries, and buyers. Specifically with Greek colonies along the Black Sea, they offered furs, slaves, and grain, and in go-back imported wine, pottery, and luxury goods. Greek writers both well known and feared them. Herodotus wrote of their strange customs, like ingesting the blood of enemies or the usage of scalps as napkins, but he also praised their justice and loyalty to relatives. Their faith turned into primal and animistic. They worshipped gods of struggle, fire, and fertility. Some rituals worried cannabis smoke, others horse sacrifice. Their worldview turned into cyclical and tied to the land, now not in phrases of possession, however sacred motion. Eventually, they diminished. Compelled by way of different nomadic businesses, just like the Sarmatians, and boxed in by way of growing empires, the Scythians dissolved into records. But they set the same old for the steppe warrior archetype. A mobile, deadly, fiercely independent fighter with no grasp and no constant domestic. They did not write books. But whilst you see an installed archer silhouetted against the steppe, that shadow is Scythian. They were the typhoon earlier than the empire. Whilst the Scythians ruled the grasslands, the Bedouins carved their legacy into sand. Originating within the massive deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, the Bedouin were not simply wanderers. They had been engineers of survival, learning a number of the maximum inhospitable terrain on the planet. In contrast to the established thunder of steppe nomads, the Bedouin lifestyles was quieter, extra deliberate. It was built across the rhythms of the barren region, drought and rainfall, grazing routes, and the moves of stars. Their domestic turned into the black goat hair tent or betelch, portable, breathable, and clean to percent. Lifestyles moved with the camels, called the ships of the desolate tract. Camels have been delivery, meals, apparel, and currency all at once. The Bedouin had been famed for their tribal structure. The whole thing revolved around the extended family. Loyalty to relations got here before all else. Honor or sheriff wasn't just a phrase. It was the social glue. An unmarried insult should start a blood feud. However, generosity to visitors, Karam turned into simply as sacred. The stranger should expect food, water, and protection for 3 days, no questions asked. Their war became rooted inside the raid, or gazu, speedy, strategic assaults designed to seize items and farm animals without needless bloodshed. Warfare wasn't approximately mass slaughter. It became about survival, prestige, and honor. A successful raid improved a man's status. A failed one could stain a tribe's recognition for generations. However, Bedouin life wasn't all war and sandstorms. It turned into wealthy and oral lifestyle. Poets had been warriors of phrases. Their verses preserved records, shamed enemies, and praised heroes. Poetry becomes surpassed from memory to reminiscence, regularly accomplished in track-like cadence across the fire. Some poems have become tribal regulation. Others have become legacy. Change caravans also exceeded through Bedouin lands. These tribesmen served as courses, protectors, and from time to time smugglers, transferring goods like incense, spices, and silk from southern Arabia to the Levant and beyond. They knew every oasis, every star route. Their understanding turned into mythical and high-priced. Though many Bedouins later incorporated into towns and empires, they maintained a fierce sense of identification. Even nowadays, the black tent and tribal codes continue to be symbols of Bedouin satisfaction. They weren't just survivors of the barren region. They were its soul. No nomadic human beings have ever reshaped the sector quite just like the Mongols. Within the 13th century, those steppe riders erupted out of the plains of Mongolia and carved out the largest contiguous land empire in records. But their roots were no distinct than the opposite nomadic cultures they observed. Cell extended family-based totally and fiercely adaptive. Lifestyles on the Mongolian steppe turned into brutal and traumatic. The Mongols lived in gur, circular felt tents that might be assembled in under an hour and packed onto a cart the next morning. Their herds, horses, yaks, goats, sustained them, and their youngsters had been raised in the saddle. Using was a talent discovered before literacy. In fact, most Mongols couldn't read, but they didn't need to. Their information became encoded in songs, proverbs, and reminiscence. What made the Mongols different became how they weaponized mobility. Under Genghis Khan, tribal divisions have been shattered and reorganized into a brand new benefit-based totally machine. Loyalty to tribe was changed by way of loyalty to the Khan. And with that, the world modified. Mongol warfare changed into a ballet of velocity and deception. Their horse archers should hearth accurately at complete gallop, fake retreats to lure enemies, and journey over 100 miles an afternoon. But they weren't just raiders. They have been strategists. They used scouts, spies, signal flags, and mental battle with terrifying precision. After they started out conquering towns, they tailored fast. Siege engineers from China and Persia joined their ranks. The Mongols found out a way to construct catapults, flaming arrows, and battering rams, and used them with chilling performance. However, here's the twist. They weren't just destroyers. The Mongol Empire related the world in methods by no means visible earlier then. They revived and protected the Silk Road, ensuring secure passage from China to Europe. Items, ideas, or even illnesses just like the Black Death traveled their good-sized community. They introduced paper forex, passport systems, and non-secular tolerance throughout their realm. A Muslim service provider, a Christian priest, and a Buddhist monk ought to all journey thoroughly beneath Mongol rule so long as they did not revolt. And yet they remained nomads at heart. Even as they governed empires, Mongol rulers nevertheless were back to their tents, their herds, and the open steppe. They conquered towns, however by no means truly belonged to them. Due to the fact, irrespective of how excessive they climbed, they always rode with the wind at their backs. To the sedentary empires, nomads had been both useful or risky, and every now and then both on the equal time. However, to nomads, the line among change and raid became negotiable. Sooner or later, they had escort your caravans throughout the desert. The following, they had plunder your border cities. It all trusted the temper, the season, and how well you paid. Trade was crucial to nomadic existence. Maximum nomads could not grow grain or make pottery. They wished equipment, textiles, spices, and comfort items. In change, they presented farm animals, furs, leather-based, salt, and individual objects like falcons or uncommon horses. A few traded directly with empires. Others operated as middlemen between remote areas, forming crucial hyperlinks along the Silk Road, incense direction, and different transcontinental paths. However, those weren't simple merchant caravans. They had been armed convoys prepared to defend themselves or attack depending on the scenario. A tribal chief would possibly negotiate with a border governor 1 week, then raid his storehouses the following. Empires called this treachery. Nomads called it options. The Scythians, as an instance, traded grain and gold to Greek cities along the Black Sea, but if a town tried to cheat them, they burned it. The Bedouins blanketed incense and spice caravans throughout Arabia, except someone did not pay protection fees. Then the camels changed route. The Mongols below Genghis Khan to begin with tried peaceful trade with the Khwarezmian Empire. However, when their traders were finished, they spoke back by annihilating whole cities. To the nomadic mind, change became non-public and political. It wasn't simply commercial enterprise. It became a reflection of recognize. If a sedentary country treated the nomads as equals, commerce thrived. If they disrespected them, the punishment became swift and commonly on horseback. This anxiety gave upward push to a strange courting. Border economies. Cities and towns on the brink of nomadic zones frequently became hybrid spaces. Half army outpost, half market. Governors bribed chieftains. Tribes traded information, horses, and intelligence. Every so often marriages had been arranged to seal fragile peace. This dance between trade and raid wasn't a flaw in nomadic lifestyles. It became a function. It allowed them to negotiate power without occupying territory, to influence empires without building them, and to remain fluid in a global that worshipped partitions. They failed to want to conquer cities. They simply wanted cities to keep watching the horizon. In an international without libraries, scrolls, or printing presses, How do you preserve your records? For nomadic cultures, the solution become easy and incredibly effective. You consider it. Oral culture wasn't just a storytelling tool for historic nomads. It became their library, courtroom, constitution, and mythos all rolled into one. From the sea and grasslands to the Mongol plains and the Bedouin deserts, memory turned into sacred, and the tongue changed into sharper than the sword. Elders had been extra than antique males and females. They had been records in human form. They knew lineages stretching returned a dozen generations, warfare memories that formed tribal identity, and proverbs that guided selections in peace and struggle alike. Those were not campfire memories, instructed for leisure. These were instructions, warnings, and legal guidelines. A number of the Bedouins, poetry turned into king. A nicely crafted verse ought to disgrace an enemy, honor a fallen warrior, or settle a dispute. Poets or shy had been advisors to tribal leaders, remembered greater honestly than many chiefs. Their words ought to ignite battle or stop it bloodless, and their memory wonderful. Complete epics had been handed down word for word, era after generation. The Mongols have been no one of a kind. The extraordinary work referred to as the secret records of the Mongols became first preserved orally, best written down later. It tells no longer simply the upward push of Genghis Khan, but the cultural values of loyalty, fate, revenge, and ambition that describe their world. It is not a dry historical record. It's a living saga at first recited with the aid of coronary heart to train and unify. Even the Scythians, who left nearly no written statistics, maintained designated oral accounts in their migrations, battles, and alliances. When Greek writers like Herodotus defined their stories, they had been shooting echoes of a much older spoken lifestyle. History exceeded via campfires, not chiseled in stone. Oral tradition had its dangers. Recollections diminished, stories advanced. However, it additionally had one huge benefit. It lived. It turned into adaptable, bendy, and deeply human. It allowed nomadic societies to keep identification even after migrations, defeats, or cultural absorption. Empires may have fallen and their records turned to dirt. However, nomadic testimonies survived, not due to the fact they had been written down, however due to the fact they were woven into breath. And so long as someone remembered, nothing became certainly lost. In many historical civilizations, women have been restrained to the background, silent, veiled, or limited at the back of palace partitions. But in nomadic societies, the tale became frequently very extraordinary. At the circulate, absolutely everyone labored, and that meant women held power too. From the Scythians to the Mongols, archaeological and ancient evidence shows that nomadic girls were now not just moms and other halves. They have been writers, warriors, shamans, diplomats, and extended family leaders. Life at the pass did not allow for idle hands. Every member of the network, no matter gender, had to contribute to survival, struggle, and governance. Take the Scythians as an instance. Burial websites across the Eurasian steppe have found out girls buried with swords, arrows, and armor, their bones showing accidents from combat. These were not symbolic burials. These girls fought. Greek historians have been so intrigued and terrified that they crafted entire myths approximately Amazon. Fierce warrior ladies, supposedly descended from these nomadic tribes. In Mongol society, ladies controlled the encampments at the same time as the men were away raiding or conquering. However, even at the highest ranges of electricity, women left their mark. Genghis Khan's daughters and daughters-in-law often ruled territories, led armies, and carried out international relations. One of the maximum effective ladies in Mongol records, Saga Khani Beki, become a strategist and kingmaker who raised emperors and brokered alliances. A number of the Bedouins, girls had fewer public leadership roles, however nevertheless wielded have an effect on through poetry, circle of relatives alliances, and the sacred traditions of hospitality. A woman's tent changed into her domain. Her capability to manipulate assets, uphold honor, and lift destiny warriors made her a crucial figure in tribal life. In some tribes, women ought to initiate divorce, manage property, and even very own camels, the ultimate image of wealth and survival. Religion also gave nomadic girls religious authority. In diverse Turk and Siberian steppe cultures, girl shamans played critical roles as healers, spirit publications, and keepers of ancestral awareness. They were not fringe mystics. They were reputable pillars of the network. In short, mobility created necessity, and necessity gave rise to equality, at the least extra than what was visible in most empires of the time. The unpredictable nature of nomadic life demanded flexibility. If a man fell in war, a lady stepped up without asking permission. In those windswept societies, a lady could be the hand that rocked the cradle and the hand that drew the bow. For nomadic peoples, spirituality was not tied to temples or sacred homes. It was woven into the land, the sky, and the journey itself. While your life is in regular motion, your gods experience with you. Nomadic perception structures had been typically animistic and nature primarily based, rooted inside the cycles of the seasons, the conduct of animals, and the rhythms of survival. The wind wasn't simply weather. It was a messenger. Mountains had been guardians. Rivers carried spirits. Hearth became sacred. Lifestyles became a talk with the unseen. A few of the Scythians, described by means of Herodotus, worship focused on a pantheon of gods tied to the herbal global. Teti, the goddess of the fire, probably equal to Hestia, and Papios, the sky god. Rituals often worried horse sacrifice, cannabis smoke, and sacred oaths sworn underneath open skies. Their non-secular world was visceral, earthy, and direct. No clergymen in gowns, just warriors and shamans calling to the heavens. The Bedouins, before the upward thrust of Islam, practiced a shape of polytheism targeted round nearby deities and tribal idols. However, in particular, they revered the unseen, the mysterious forces of destiny and nature. Jinn, or spirits, had been believed to dwell in rocks, windstorms, and lonely locations. Poets and seers were concept to be stimulated, every so often even possessed with the aid of these entities. Hospitality wasn't just a custom. It became a non-secular duty. In Mongol culture, the religious international turned into dependent round Tangrism, the worship of Tangri, the eternal blue sky. Tangri wasn't a god you prayed to in a temple. He became the sky itself, ever-present, watching and judging. Genghis Khan claimed his right to rule got here from Tangri. Mongols also respected earth spirits, ancestral ghosts, and the sacred hearth in the center of every tent. Shamanism played an essential role. Shamans had been healers, spirit guides, and political advisors. The beauty of nomadic spirituality turned into its adaptability. As nomads got here into touch with Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and others, they often mixed those beliefs with their own. Mongol emperors patronized multiple religions right away. A Bedouin should observe Islamic regulation while still clinging to older, desert-rooted customs. Whereas towns built temples to contain the divine, nomads carried the sacred with them. Their gods moved, their rituals adapted, and their ideals flowed just like the rivers they crossed. Because to a nomad, religion did not want four walls, simply sky above, earth beneath, and memory in among. They didn't depart at the back of pyramids or cathedrals. You might not find their capitals on current maps. But the legacy of historical nomadic cultures is written throughout history within the glide of trade, the scars of conquest, and even the languages we speak. Nomads had been not ancient footnotes. They had been architects of disruption, reshaping entire continents through movement. The Silk Street, that wasn't only a route for silk and spices. It became a highway built through hooves, maintained by the diplomacy, muscle, and local know-how of nomadic tribes. Without them, East and West might by no means have met. Empires feared them, and for excellent purpose. The Xians, Xiongnu, Turks, and Mongols all challenged the myth of urban superiority. Their victories uncovered an essential fact. Mobility can outthink monuments. Where empires moved slowly, nomads adapted. When cities trusted partitions, nomads relied on pace. But their affect wasn't best military. They acted as cultural bridges, sporting song, recipes, tales, or even faith from one global to another. Mongol rule delivered Chinese language printing generation to Persia. Arab Bedouin traditions shaped the early Islamic international, from language and regulation to poetry and honor codes. Turkish nomads laid the foundation for the Ottoman Empire. The trails they rode have become arteries of civilization. Even after their empires diminished, their spirit continued. You could see it in contemporary horsemanship, in oral storytelling cultures, and inside the values of kinship, resilience, and independence that also echo across the steppe, wilderness, and tundra. In lots of ways, they also function a warning. They remind us that no structure is everlasting, no longer even the grandest empire. They proved that the wind may want to erase borders, and that power failed to want to be carved in stone to be real. Today, many nomadic peoples still exist, though fewer in wide variety and regularly below strain from present-day borders, climate change, and urbanization. But their descendants bring traditions older than most international locations. Hospitality to strangers, reverence for animals, and testimonies that trip through generations like horses through fog. So whilst you take a look at records, do not simply look at the partitions, the temples, the thrones. Appearance between them. That is where the nomads lived, and that's in which history moved. Inside the mid-1800s, the United States changed into a rustic divided not simply by politics, however via terrain. The East bustled with towns, factories, and ports. The West became a wild expanse of mountains, deserts, and gold fields. And among them stretched over 1,700 m of unforgiving desert. To journey from NY to California supposed weeks on a deliver round Cape Horn, or months in a wagon, dodging disease, bandits, and dust. However, the dream became there. A railroad that could tie the country collectively. Metallic rail by metal rail. An immediate line from coast to coast. Unthinkable to some, inevitable to others. Visionaries believed it can unite the republic, speed up conversation, move armies, open new markets, and settle the untamed frontier. To construct it, but could require extra than ambition. It would take cash, exertions, land, and political electricity. That ultimate element came with the Civil Warfare. In 1862, even as the nation was tearing itself apart, Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act. The law authorized two railroad corporations, the Union Pacific and the Valuable Pacific, to start constructing from contrary ends of the country. The Union Pacific could head west from Omaha, Nebraska. The relevant Pacific might move east from Sacramento, California. They would meet inside the center. To fuel the construction, the authorities offered large land grants. For every mile of song laid, every organization received as much as 640 acres of public land and generous loans. The race became on, not just to unite the country, however to claim land, money, and history itself. On paper, it changed into a marvel of infrastructure. In truth, it became about to come to be one of the most grueling creation efforts in American history. Workers could blast via mountains, bridge sizable plains, and brave bitter winters and scorching deserts. Thousands of immigrants and people might be brought in to do the work. The rewards could be huge, however so would the human value. And for the indigenous countries living at the land where the tracks would reduce through like a scar, this turned into now not progress. It was a caution. In 1862, the concept still gave the impression of a big gamble, but inside 7 years, lines would meet in the Utah wilderness and trade the USA for all time. At the same time as the Union Pacific had the flat plains of Nebraska in advance of them, the vital Pacific faced a far greater brutal assignment from the very start: the Sierra Nevada mountains. These were not mild hills. They had been towering granite peaks at risk of avalanches, snow drifts, and backbreaking terrain. And this was earlier than dynamite was even invented. Creation started in Sacramento in 1863. However, the real wall stood just 80 m east. The Sierras were a powerful barricade, and each mile of track laid felt like a battle in opposition to nature itself. To conquer this impediment, the significant Pacific needed exertions. Quite a few it. Before everything, they employed mainly Irish immigrants and white laborers, but many not able or unwilling to stand the grueling conditions. It's when the agency turned to a new group of workers, Chinese immigrants. With the aid of 1865, over 10,000 Chinese people have been constructing the railroad. More than of the valuable Pacific's complete personnel. They had been paid much less than white employees, frequently lived in more risky situations, and confronted deep racism. But they proved imperative, displaying first-rate skill, staying power, and discipline. Their work was heroic and horrific. They carved tunnels through solid rock, using only hand gear and black powder. The most notorious tunnel-wide Variety 6 took almost 2 years to complete. In wintry weather, snow drifts reached 40 toes. Workers lived in camps buried beneath snow, connected by using vertical shafts like chimneys. Dozens died in avalanches, explosions, and rock slides. And yet the line advanced. To hurry progress, Chinese crews suspended themselves in baskets over cliffs, chipping away at stone inch by means of inch. Once they could not pass around a mountain, they went through it. When they couldn't level terrain, they built wood trestles that soared above ravines. It becomes some of the maximum risky and underappreciated exertions in American history. Few facts exist of individual Chinese language people. No statues were built for them at the time. However, without their palms, the transcontinental dream could have died within the Sierras. By 1867, the valuable Pacific eventually emerged from the mountains. What lay ahead changed into desolate tract, harsh, dry, and deadly, but flat. The worst become in the back of them. The race to the assembly factor became certainly on. Even as the vital Pacific changed into fighting granite and snow within the West, the Union Pacific had its own gauntlet to run. Beginning from Omaha, Nebraska, the corporation laid song westward through the exceptional plains, a land that regarded countless, flat, and deceptively easy. However, the venture wasn't the geography. It turned into people, politics, and electricity. The Union Pacific employed largely Irish immigrants, former Union squatties, and freed men. Many have been veterans seeking out regular pay after the Civil Warfare. Crews ought to lay 2, once in a while even 3 miles of track in an unmarried day. The huge open plains allowed pace, but in addition they exposed the employees to raids, hunger, and environmental extremes. This was indigenous land. The Pawnee, Cheyenne, Arapjo, and Lakota Sioux had hunted, lived, and died on these plains for generations. And to them, the railroad was not development. It turned into an invasion. The tune cut directly via tribal-looking grounds. The smoke-belching engines frightened buffalo herds. Telegraph poles and surveyors disrupted sacred spaces. Tribes saw what turned into coming. Settlers, infantrymen, fences, and displacement. Resistance was inevitable. The Lakota Sioux, underneath leaders like Red Cloud, fought back fiercely. They raided camps, attacked surveying groups, and tore up rails. In response, the US authorities built forts alongside the direction and stationed troops to guard the track. Railroad construction have become a militarized operation, with tune layers operating underneath the protection of armed guards. It was a low-grade war fought with rifles and treaties that never lasted. For the indigenous international locations, the railroad represented a dying sentence for his or her manner of life, and that they were proper. Nonetheless, the Union Pacific driven forward. Financially subsidized via big federal loans and led by means of men like Thomas Durant, the organization laid music at breakneck pace. Crews lived in brief towns, dubbed Hell on Wheels, which sprang up in a single day and disappeared simply as rapid. Playing whiskey and violence followed the employees like a dust typhoon. By using 1867, Union Pacific had reached Cheyenne and headed into Wyoming. The mountains loomed within the distance. But the actual mountain they were climbing became political. How do you unite a state while you're laying rails over the bones of another? For the Union Pacific, the answer became easy. Lay the song. Don't look again. The tale of the Transcontinental Railroad is often instructed with golden spikes and outstanding guys in top hats. However the actual story, it is soaked in sweat, muscle, and ache. Much of it furnished via men whose names were in no way recorded, whose graves were by no means marked, and whose testimonies have been buried under the tracks they built. At the valuable Pacific, it became the Chinese workers who did the impossible. Nearly 15,000 of them, most hailing from Guangdong province, persisted freezing temperatures, lethal explosions, and racial hostility while tunneling via the Sierra Nevada. They earned much less than white workers, obtained no recognition, and were regularly housed in separate inferior camps. However, they continued quietly, skillfully, and relentlessly. In spite of being referred to as vulnerable and unfit through early skeptics, the Chinese crews soon proved to be the most reliable group of workers on the railroad. They blasted rock, laid rail, built trestles, and cooked their very own food, regularly staying healthier than their opposite numbers. But whilst the final spike turned into pushed at Promontory Point, none of them were invited to the birthday celebration image. Meanwhile, at the Union Pacific, Irish immigrants made up a huge portion of the team of workers. Many had survived famine and war best to face new dangers at the plains. They fought off raids, laid tune at notable velocity, and drank themselves to sleep in rickety tents. Their lives have been hard, however their exertions become critical. Former enslaved Africanamians also worked the rails, a few employed as freed guys searching for higher lives. Their contributions, like those of the Chinese and Irish, went largely uncredited. Employees of color had been exploited, however vital. This changed into a multinational team of workers, constructing a country with bare fingers and broken backs. And then there had been the chefs, blacksmiths, teamsters, and supply haulers, each playing a function in keeping the splendid device of progress transferring forward. None of them were executives. But without them, there'd be no golden spike. In the grand American fable, we have a tendency to highlight the visionaries and tycoons. However, railroads were not laid by way of dreams by myself. They were laid by calloused fingers, underpaid guys, and marginalized people. People who bent history without a guarantee they had be remembered. They failed to construct the railroad for glory. They built it to continue to exist. By way of the past due 1860s, the two railroad corporations, the Union Pacific and the Critical Pacific, were not simply building tracks. They had been locked in a frenzied competition, every racing toward an invisible meeting factor someplace in the Utah Territory. However, this wasn't a gentleman's settlement. It became a conflict for land, money, and prestige. Why the urgency? Because of the manner the government subsidies labored. For each mile of tune finished, each organization obtained federal land offers and hefty loans. The greater track you constructed, the more profit you claimed. So naturally, each side's attempted to outbuild the alternative, even laying parallel tracks in opposite instructions, understanding full properly that most effective one set could be used. It became absurd. Crews labored at breakneck pace. The Principal Pacific, fresh off their victory over the Sierra Nevada, now blasted through the Nevada and Utah deserts. Meanwhile, the Union Pacific crossed rivers and high plains, skirting the brink of the Rocky Mountains. They even started out laying music via regions they knew the government might eventually declare wasteful simply to secure funding. Work intensified to near manic degrees. The Vital Pacific's Chinese crews set an international report in April 1869. 10 m of track laid in an unmarried day, a feat unrivaled even these days. They finished this using synchronized groups, rotating shifts, and a rhythm honed through years of hard work. Union Pacific crews, now not to be outdone, driven hard from the east notwithstanding ongoing hard work moves, supply problems and mismanagement from their financier, Thomas Durant, who turned into more interested by stock manipulation than railroad engineering. The two tracks in the end neared every different at Promontory Summit in present-day Utah. Surveyors marked the website online. Preparations had been made for a formal ceremony. Locomotives from each company's, Primary Pacific's Jupiter and Union Pacific's Wide Variety 1119, were introduced face to face, cow catcher to cow catcher. Executives prepared speeches. A unique golden spike was commissioned. Telegraph wires had been established to transmit the very last hammer blows in real time throughout the U.S. However, at the back of the birthday celebration become the lingering reality. The race had been brutal, often reckless, and absolutely pushed by means of profit. The rails had been now joined, but the scars they left at the back of on land, labor and lives might remain for generations. Development had an end line, and each corporations were inclined to trample over something to go it. On May 10, 1869, the windswept plains of Promontory Summit, Utah, became the middle of the Yankee universe. A crowd of people, officers, reporters, and railroad executives accumulated to witness the momentous occasion, the joining of the Union Pacific and significant Pacific railroads, the entirety of the Transcontinental Railroad. Two glowing locomotives stood nose-to-nose on the finished tune, the significant Pacific's Jupiter and the Union Pacific's Quantity 119. Between them lay a very last rail, and at its center, a golden spike engraved with the phrases, "May additionally God hold the team spirit of our USA as this railroad unites the two first-rate oceans of the world." Telegraph lines had been related to the ceremonial hammer. Each blow could ship an electric sign throughout the United States of America. As Leland Stanford, representing the primary Pacific, raised the sledgehammer, individuals across the state leaned in to listen. With each swing, the telegraph clicked. Finished. Church bells rang, cannons fired, cities erupted in birthday celebration. From New York to San Francisco, it turned into as though a national artery have been stitched together in real time. The East and West were not months aside. They had been 7 days apart via rail. It turned into a beautiful engineering achievement. The United States was now sure coast to coast by way of metal and steam. The symbolic importance couldn't be overstated. A young put-up civil conflict kingdom had verified it can join its fractured parts and march into a current business generation. But no longer every person was part of the birthday party. None of the Chinese people who had laid maximum of the relevant Pacific's tune had been invited to the image. They had been excluded from the right entirely regardless of their position in conducting the impossible. The Irish workers, freedmen, local publications, and different marginalized workers have been also absent from the frame. In their region stood bearded guys in frock coats protecting hammers and cigars. So at the same time as the country celebrated harmony, the truth changed into more complex. The railroad did join east to west. However, it additionally sharpened divisions between races, classes, and cultures. It united markets, but at the price of many human lives. The image that day captured the legit story of the railroad. However, the actual tale that become buried under the track. The crowning glory of the Transcontinental Railroad did not simply reduce geography. It exploded the Yankee economy. Nearly overnight, The us turned into no longer a bicoastal nation awkwardly bridged by barren region. It changed into now a single financial organism, pulsing with motion, trade, and possibility. Items that when took months to transport by wagon or ship may want to now pass from coast to coast in underneath per week. Agricultural merchandise from the Midwest, wheat, corn, cattle, may be shipped westward to booming mining cities or eastward to the economic towns. Manufactured goods flowed inside the opposite route. Rail vehicles replaced oxen. Steam replaced sail. What had once been an unsure frontier became now a worthwhile deliver chain. Cities sprouted like weeds along the railroad. Railroad cities that grew up almost in a single day. Some became cities, others disappeared as quickly as they came, especially if the rail line shifted. However, everyone changed into a node in a developing community, connected by way of a consistent rhythm of pistons, whistles, and smoke. The railroad also helped gas commercial growth. Iron works, coal mines, timber generators all surged with demand. The need for rails, locomotives, and infrastructure created jobs throughout the nation. Steel barons and railroad tycoons were given rich. Bankers coated their wallet. And small-time entrepreneurs rode the wave, starting lodges, restaurants, and widespread stores alongside the line. Mail moved quicker. News traveled throughout time zones in days rather than weeks. For the first time, the authorities may want to venture actual presence throughout the whole continent, deploying troops, assets, and political influence any place the rails reached. And let's now not forget the human element. Millions of people moved west. Immigrants from Europe who once landed in Big Apple now saw a right-of-way route to land and exertions in California, Oregon, and the Western Territories. Homesteaders, prospectors, ranchers, and outlaws all rode the identical metallic road closer to future. Of route, this growth wasn't lightly shared. Wealth flowed upward. Native lands have been gobbled. Laborers remained bad. But there's no denying it. The railroad converted the us from a local republic right into a continental strength. The engine wasn't just moving humans. It changed into transferring money, strength, and the destiny. And as soon as it started, it wasn't going to prevent. Underneath the polished metallic and victorious headlines of the Transcontinental Railroad lay a darker, more tragic legacy. The destruction of indigenous lands, lives, and cultures. The railroad did not simply connect east and west. It sliced through native homelands, carving out routes via territories held through the Lakota, Cheyenne, Shawnee, Ute, and plenty of others. What had once been open plains and sacred floor was now divided with the aid of rails, telegraph poles, and fencing. With every spike driven, native sovereignty became eroded. The impact turned into instant and brutal. Buffalo herds critical to plains, tribes, economies, diets, and spirituality have been slaughtered en masse to clean the manor for trains and settlers. In some cases, passengers had been advocated to shoot buffalo for recreation from shifting trains. Those herds, as soon as numbering in the tens of millions, faded to close to extinction in just a few many years. The railroad added more than tracks. It delivered settlers, infantrymen, and surveyors. Towns popped up where there had been none. Homesteaders, empowered by means of the federal government, staked claims on tribal lands. What treaties hadn't taken? The railroad now absorbed, and with settlers got here enforcement, military garrisons dispatched to protect the tracks and suppress any resistance. Conflicts erupted. The Sioux, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and other tribes fought lower back in what have become a series of bloody wars. A few classified uprisings, others outright massacres. From Red Cloud's struggle to the Battle of Little Bighorn, the railroads have been both the battleground and the prize. Sooner or later, resistance was crushed. Indigenous nations had been restrained to reservations, frequently loads of miles from their ancestral lands. The psychological toll was huge. Sacred sites were desecrated. Looking patterns have been broken. Nomadic cultures constructed around seasonal migration and sizable open space have been pressured into constant places beneath constant surveillance. And it all was justified in the call of progress. The Transcontinental Railroad became hailed as a wonder of Yankee ingenuity. However, it got here at the value of 1,000 nations' desires. It wasn't simply the iron that reduced through the land. It became the erasure of a way of life, changed with the aid of timmets and timbers. Records books regularly praise the railroad for uniting a nation, but for native peoples, it tore theirs aside. When the very last spike was driven at Promontory Summit in 1869, it wasn't simply the quit of a railroad. It changed into the beginning of a brand new American identity. Faster, hungrier, and increasingly more formed via metallic and steam. The Transcontinental Railroad shrank the United States of America. What had as soon as taken 6 months via wagon or ship now took 7 days through rail. It changed how humans moved, how items had been exchanged, and the way the very idea of distance became understood. Suddenly, the concept of a coast-to-coast nation wasn't a dream. It became an everyday reality. The railroad fueled the upward thrust of time zones, created to coordinate Go United States tour and trade. It reorganized agriculture, permitting farmers to send produce across kingdom strains. It powered the second commercial revolution, allowing uncooked substances to float successfully into city factories. The rhythm of the United States of America started out to suit the clatter of trains. Culturally, the railroad strengthened a feel of manifest future, the perception that America becomes supposed to span from Atlantic to Pacific. It made enlargement feel no longer just feasible, however inevitable. With rails stretching across deserts, mountains, and plains, there has been not a wild frontier. The whole lot felt reachable. Everything felt claimable. However, the railroad also set the template for corporate electricity in America. Huge wealth collected on the top. Men like Leland Stanford, Thomas Durant, and Collies Huntington didn't simply get wealthy. They formed coverage, offered politicians, and built empires. Corruption scandals like the credit score Moblier affair exposed how deeply railroad pastimes have been embedded in authorities. For people, the train tracks marked each possibility and exploitation. For indigenous peoples, it marked the end of an international. For the environment, it brought radical alternate. Forests cleared, rivers bridged, buffalo almost exterminated. But for all its expenses, the railroad undeniably stitched the fabric of a contemporary America. It connected immigrants to opportunity, companies to markets, and governments to remote territories. It converted an experimental republic into a fully incorporated kingdom. The iron rails did not simply carry passengers. They carried ambition, destruction, desire, and hubris. The railroad was each a triumph and a tragedy. And once the one's dual locomotives touched cow catchers in the Utah wasteland, the United States of America changed into by no means the equal again. The state changed into converted no longer via war or election, however by iron and fire.